we are back again with the weekly podcast. So today I have Arvinder Nirvan with me, who is a data governance analyst. We will learn about what data governance analyst is, what this role is, and what data means in any sector. So Arvinder, he is very prominent in data analysis, data governance. He's in the banking sector. So we will eventually get into that. So how a data flow in the banking sector. Once one go to the bank, they provide all the information, then all the transaction, all the things happens. But there's a lot that happens in the background. So it is an interesting field. So we will explore it for the school going children, college going children, as well as everybody around. If somebody has some interest, they can always ask the follow-up questions and find if this field is useful for them. So now I request Arvinder to please introduce him.
Thank you, Gurtej, for having me here. I've worked in the banking industry. Been working for banks for about 8 years now, uh, mostly around data roles, data analyst, business data analyst, and currently working as data governance analyst at Bank of the West. So there's Gurtej, there's not a whole lot to talk about me. So I think I'll just put an end to there. So yeah, that's about me.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Arvinder. So let's see what this role in a banking sector looks like, because data is everywhere, information is everywhere. If we enter our username, our name, our date of birth, and everything, that comprises of the information and data, and it is processed in every industry. So can you please share us with how a data analyst or governance analyst it looks like in a banking industry?
Sure, Gurtej. I think the audience can see my screen now. So let me get started. Uh, really want to get started, Gurtej. You were saying, how does banking stuff looks from outside? All right. But let's start talking about from scratch. When you think about a bank, you think about a customer. You think about the bank itself. Most of us use online banking, right? That's our way to go, first preference. If it doesn't work, if something we need something else, we call the call center. We talk to someone from the bank, to discuss our accounts or get anything done. Or we could also go to the branch. Other thing, if we kind of think a little more deeper in what bank is, we may think about management. Yes, bank will have management. There'll be a back office. There are a whole lot of folks working in the background. And then there is a role that government agencies play. We sometimes read in the news, so-and-so bank got fined for multiple reasons. So there are government agencies who kind of keep an eye on the activities of the banks. So as an outsider, I think this is pretty much what we think of the bank, Gurtej. As we go forward, we would talk a little bit more about how does data kind of interact and flows within the bank's world, right?
Right. So from outside, yeah, it looks like there is a customer goes in the bank and they have the front end. They provide their credit card, debit card, or their information. Then everything is on the computer that is verified and the customer gets benefit from. So that I think that part is the data. So it is stored in warehouses, it is stored in servers where the front end who is helping the customer, they put in the information, they verify, authenticate so that the same customer gets the valued service from them. So now let's hear from you. So what that backend looks like.
Exactly. So in this picture, you see this all these people working in the branch. They have a monitor. Now let's clear the board again and um, talk about the data, right? And before we talk about the data, Gurtej, I want to talk a little bit about what data is. There may be people in the audience who are kind of new to that data concept. So I want to present an Excel analogy. That's what I like to call it. Let's see, we have Excel file. I think all of us have seen Excel file. I put some random data in this sample file. In an Excel file, we have a workbook, right? This whole thing. And then we have multiple tabs. I don't know if it's big enough. There are 3 tabs in this workbook. We have rows. They are like multiple rows. And we have columns. And the data actually gets stored in rows and columns in an Excel spreadsheet. And the reason I have it here, Gurtej, is because it's very similar to the relational database. That's one of the kind of databases we have. And we're going to use that as an example today. Um, right, this cylindrical shape is a universal model that is used to represent database. Within the database, there are schemas, tables, and within tables, there are rows and columns. And the reason I have this side by side is that a schema is like an Excel workbook pretty much. Table is similar to these tabs, and then we have rows and columns in database that shows the data itself. Therefore, the analogy, right? It's very similar. If you think about Excel, you know what exactly is going in a database. The only difference is in Excel, you can open an Excel sheet and see the rows and the columns. But in database, you cannot just open database and do the same. It's something that happens in the back end. You need some tools to go into the database and look at rows and the columns, basically, and the data.
So we can say that all the Excel files, they are stored somewhere in a database. So what database is? So can you give some examples which prominent companies they have created the database and what are their names and what kinds of variety we have in the industry for the database?
Yeah, so like anything in the market, Gurtej, there are so many kinds, right? The most commonly used in banking industry is Oracle database and Microsoft SQL Server. Really, the Oracle, and it gets fancier. There are companies out there who has lots and lots of data. Typically, retail companies like Walmart, right, or companies that capture a whole lot of customer data. They move on to things like Hadoop, big data. Banking industry, usually Oracle. So to your question, there are multiple brands for database as well. And my experience, because I work in banking industry, is mainly in Oracle.
So they are stored somewhere in the hardware devices, like in the big cabinet infrastructure, or how this information, where it is normally stored.
That's correct. So you rightly said that this data is stored in servers, which is pretty much like computer, but it doesn't have screen and all the good stuff that we use to access the computers, right? So that's where the database is. And I think you draw a perfect analogy as well, that these Excel spreadsheets, think about it, Excel spreadsheet stored somewhere. So that's exactly what database is.
So, Ravinder, if we talk about, so now there's lots of information. So you are sharing with us from the banking sector. You mentioned Walmart, Facebook, everything has the information. They have to be stored somewhere. So there's a terminology called cloud computing
Mhm.
or the cloud database. So what is the difference between the exact data warehouse and the cloud database?
So cloud database, Gurtej, is data that is stored offsite, basically. There are companies that sell services. For example, if you have a firm and you don't want to have your own infrastructure, and forgive me if I'm using some technical words here. I want to keep it very simple. So you can choose to have your own database stored physically in a bank's location, for example, or at a data center owned by the bank, or you can choose to use it as a service from an outside party. Um, in that case, you just use their service, and those servers are physically located with some other companies. You just use the service. It would appear that your data is kind of getting stored nowhere. That's why, therefore, the cloud. But it's actually servers. It's not physically located for the company that you work for.
Right. No, I was reading a terminology called data farm. So I think like we see the almond farms and peach farms. So these big companies like Amazon or Google or maybe the Oracle, so they have huge infrastructure somewhere. So which is not present at the location where customers are working. All the Excel files or just a smaller example, all the data, all the information that goes there and stored physically at those locations.
Mhm.
So, yeah, no, it's a huge infrastructure. So now, Arvinder, can you please share how this analogy or how this data works in a banking industry?
Sure. Let's go to our next slide and clear the board and start it over again. We have our customer, we have our online banking, contact center, and branch. Let's bring in our management, the government agencies. And this backend team, I replaced it with sales team, and I'll explain you why I did that. Right now, we were talking about this customer coming in, talking to one of these guys here. Uh, What essentially this customer is doing is giving information to these people, Gurtej, and these people will enter some of that information in their systems, right? And that turns into data. So let's draw some arrows here. Uh, all the information stored in their systems in the back end gets stored in these databases. Now, I guess it'll be a little easier for the audience to connect with what these cylindrical shapes mean. Um, One interesting thing I want to point out here, Gurtej, is that when we go to a bank, right, we think that whether we want to talk about credit card, savings, checkings, the customer service person seems to be going to the similar screen and using the same system, right? One would think that or assume that all the information goes into the same application, but that's not true. Um, there are numerous applications that your standard customer service representative at the bank will use. From the backend standpoint, in this example, and this is not an actual infrastructure of any bank. This is a general example. Uh, in this example, all the credit card data gets stored in one database because this call center person is using a separate application for credit card processes. Savings, checkings, mortgages, they all have their own applications in this example. And therefore, they get saved separately in different databases. So that's how it gets very complicated in the back end. Now, let me add a little bit more detail here. Now, the data in these different databases got to be used by management, for example, right? Management has certain needs. They want to pull some reports and take actions, make decisions based on those reports. But the challenge with the management is that they don't just want credit card data. They don't just want savings data. They want kind of all of it, right? And in a way that is meaningful to them. Let me add some arrows here. So Gurtej, what we are seeing here is data marts. First one, management reporting, regulatory reporting, and sales reporting. Now, Gurtej, let me draw another analogy here, right? You go to Walmart, for example, right? You go to clothes section, you'll see one whole section for the kids, one for the men, adults, for women, and in the kids sections, you'll get everything for the kids, right? For their shirts, their pants, their PJs, their shoes, and everything, right? Um, if you take a step back from Walmart to their warehouse, you could imagine that that's not how the clothes will be stored in the warehouse, right? Back in the store, probably they are stored by the brand. All the Levi stuff at one place, and all the by brand, maybe they'll definitely have some other way to organize it, right?
Right.
But at the point when it hits the floor of a Walmart, it gets reorganized, Gurtej, in a way that it makes it easier for the consumers to buy and look for it, right? This is exactly, Gurtej, what is happening here. The same data gets reorganized in a way that is meaningful and useful for the management in the first example, right? And again, government agencies, they ask the financial organizations all sorts of reporting. We'll give you some examples. They'll say, hey, any bank that has over 50 million of revenue, you need to send me your loan level data for all your loans, and then I want a high level summary of all your deposits and checking accounts. Just throwing out an example, right? Uh, in that case, data in these different databases is not going to work. So it has to be reorganized in a way that government agencies accept them, right? So we create another database here, reorganize the data. Then, as per the analogy, take all the stuff for the kids and put them at one place, right? So that's it's easier for the government agencies to understand it. And then create another one, same data, all of it reorganized for the management. And then yet another one for sales team, because sales team will be interested in totally different dimensions, right? So let's create one for them. So in the back end, all this transformation and hops of the data happen all the time. And talking about hops, let's call it hop number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in a very simple architectural diagram, Gurtej, we have these 5 data hops. And things get complex as data moves from one place to another. And that's where data governance analyst and data analyst role comes in. I'll take a pause here, Gurtej, to see if you have any question.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of envisioning that in a small city there are multiple branches. in one branch there are many customers, and I would say in a whole country everybody has an account. So all this information has been stored in, so you showed us one Excel, so I'm envisioning, so every person's information is stored somewhere, and that's a huge information that has to give value as well. So they have to analyze it, the government has to oversee if the banking sectors they are providing adequate services to the customers, and the customers want to see that every customer is seeing what they need. So like there should not be a mismatch, there should not be a mistake. So it is very robust application or the infrastructure how the banking sector works. So now can you please share us what the role that data governance analyst, so what this role is about and
Sure,
how this role works in a banking sector?
sure, you got it. Okay, so let's step back a little bit. We want to zoom in this management example. So we have the same architecture with the same 5 hops. Let's zoom in into this management part a little bit, right? Turns out management has some questions. They are looking at this fancy dashboard with some pie charts, their information, and they have a question. Now, that's kind of me for my bank. And the data governance analyst comes in and says, hey, I may be able to help. There are a number of things, Gurtej, that data governance analyst does, right? For now, I'm going to throw some fancy words out there, Gurtej, but in a moment, I'm going to explain in simple words what all of this is. So a data governance analyst would work on data definition, the lineage, in other words, the data hops, data accountability, data quality, and some other stuff. So I'll leave it to that. I want to go to the next slide, Gurtej, and talk about this in a simple English. Let me know if you have any question on this one, though.
In this slide only data analyst, he's smiling, not everybody else. It seems
because
like a wonderful role.
because he's the one with the answer, Gurtej. And it happens sometimes he does not have the answer, and that smile goes away very fast. Yeah, that's funny. Okay. Let's redraw the picture. Let's bring our management and the data governance analyst. The fancy words, the fancy terms I was talking about. Let's see this some conversation between the management and the data governance analyst, who, by the way, is still smiling. So the management is looking at the dashboard and saying that, hey, the total deposit balance that I'm looking at, does it include the frozen or the dormant accounts, or does it just include the active accounts? Right? The management is not sure. By the way, Gurtej, management in here is fully aware of all the hops and the transformation that data has gone through. So they want to make sure that along the data journey, nothing bad happened to the data, right? Sometimes things go wrong, and what ends up going to the dashboards is totally wrong or doesn't add up. So therefore, the questions, right? In this case, data governance analyst goes says, hey, I created a data dictionary, which is a great source for all the definitions of what you're looking at your dashboard. Gurtej, I think both of us go back to the time, we are from the time where we used to have little books called data dictionaries, and we would open the data, not the data dictionaries, the actual English dictionaries, right? So we would open the dictionaries and look for the meaning, right? This data dictionary is very similar. So everything that these two folks are looking at their dashboards, all the data points, that dictionary would have the meaning, the definition of each of that term. And it's data governance analyst's job to put that dictionary together, or his team. So that's one of the things that data governance data governance analyst does. And when we say data definition, that's what it means. So a couple more things here, Gurtej. The management goes, okay, then where are these numbers coming from anyway? They want to know what's the source of these numbers, right? And analyst says, hey, we have a lineage document that traces all the data hops. We talked about those 5 hops, Gurtej, and there is some documentation out there. There has to be one, because if these guys are looking at some numbers, there has to be a traceability back to its origin, right? In case there's a question, one should know where those numbers are coming from. That's another role for data governance analyst or data analyst, to put together a lineage document. which could be in Excel or in some kind of application, but essentially will tell you story of each hop that data has taken in its journey. So that's another thing. In data world is called data lineage.
Right.
And lastly, if we have any concern, where do we go? There's a data quality concern. Where do we go? Again, the data governance analyst comes to the rescue. One of the key job of data governance team, Krutej, is to maintain list of owners, data owners. We saw all those hops of data, and at each point there has to be some people, a team or a person who's responsible for the data within that periphery, right? So if there's something wrong, it's like a plumbing job. There's a pipeline, we know where the blockage is. Once we identify where the blockage is, the next thing is to identify who's the owner of that area, right? If we don't know who the owner is, who's going to fix it? We don't know who to involve to get the fix done, right? So it's the job of data governance analyst to make sure that for each data hub, there are actual owners documented, they are in the loop, they are on board. If any question or issue comes up, folks should be able to go back to those data owners to get the remediation done.
So Ravinder, the role of a data analyst, so that seems to be very important because they have to make sure that every customer gets their valued service because it's money involved. The other thing is their personal information, their social security, everything is there. And it's not some customer, it's the whole country. So if we are talking about the banking sector, yeah, you have to follow the governance rules and play around with lots and lots of information. So if you say in every day, in one day, so what would be the roles of a data governance analyst in a day-to-day activity? What kinds of things a data governance analyst do in a bank?
Sure, Gutej, and that's exactly what we have on our next slide. What does a data governance analyst do in a typical day? Tej, whole lot of meetings. We talked about data owners and the consumers. In this example, it was the management to understand their needs, to find that blockage. In our example, we use a plumbing example. So meetings with data owners, data consumers, other teams, performing data analysis. We briefly touched upon that we can see Excel sheet just by opening it up, right? But for database, we need a tool and write a little code to actually look at the data and do some analysis on it. So it's called SQL code. We do a lot of SQL querying on the databases, sometimes to understand how the data is flowing, sometimes to do some root cause analysis when there's a problem. And then we review a lot of existing documentation, Gurtej. One thing I noticed here is that within probably it's a common thing. An average time a person stays in one job is around 2 to 3 years. That's what I would think. It's not a fact, but that's kind of my estimate, right? People move on. They take their knowledge with them. What they leave behind is documentation. It's very important for a data governance analyst to be able to access those documentation and review it so that they understand and know what the person before them knew, right? So there's a whole lot of reviewing the documentation to understand the data flow, for example. And then we'd already talked about creating data dictionary, data lineage. Then we create process documents as well, presentations, and answering ad hoc questions, just like we saw in the previous slide, right? And yeah, that's pretty much a typical day of a data governance analyst.
Yeah, so Arvinder, you mentioned a data like performance data analysis. So are there some tools involved to do that performance reporting like Tableau, Business BI, or what are the terminologies if some advanced listeners are listening to us? So what kinds of those tools are there in market?
Yes, you're right, Kritesh. There are various tools. I would categorize them into two parts. One, they're a little more fancier, right? You mentioned Tableau. Tableau, OBIE, Crystal Reports, they have these nice screens where users can go in and pull the data. It's like a very visual thing. And they can pull, for example, if you want to know the sales by branch, right? And you'll see a sales figure assigned there. You can pull that down, and then you'll see the branch written somewhere. You can pull that to your screen, and you will see a report generating right in front of you, right? So that's like giving a front end to someone to do some data analysis just by dragging and dropping. That's one way of doing it. And there are multiple tools. I named a couple of them, right? And the second way of doing it is to go to the back end directly. That's what data analysts or data governance analysts would mostly do. We don't usually use Tableau and dashboards. That's kind of for folks who are in the management and they want to see summary of the data. They just want to see the information. But if you want to get your hands dirty with the data, you use tools like Toad, Oracle Developer. These are some tools that hook onto the database, those cylindrical shapes that we saw, and you write some pieces of code to pull the data out of it, and then you can export it to the Excel sheet. Or there is a little screen at the bottom where you can see those rows and columns. And then you can keep adding to the code to see the data, to slice and dice the data the way you want to do it. So these are two categories of tools that data governance analysts would use.
Yeah, no, in a simple form, as you explained, I can say that information is out there, but it is in raw form.
Mm-hmm.
So these tools, they help to allow somebody to make sense very quickly. So like if a company has to open another branch, like you mentioned about the Walmart, so it will give you how many kids clothing are there, how many, so every day, how many are used, so that they can plan, they can order ahead so that all their aisles are pretty much filled. So these tools are very useful as well. So then you mentioned about SQL. So what SQL is and what other kinds of tools are there in relation to that?
So SQL, it has two meanings really, Gurtej. One is SQL as in language. Um, SQL language is pretty much like learning any other language. It's a way of talking to the computer and telling the computer, this is exactly what I want from the database. Pull it for me. So it looks like a code. If you have, or the audience has ever seen code written, a piece of code, it wouldn't make sense to an untrained eye. But if you have learned it a little bit, you'll be able to make sense of it. If you have ever seen a, a technician doing ultrasound, Gurtej, you would figure out that you don't see anything, but the person who's doing the ultrasound will be able to figure out what's where, right? That's exactly with the code. You write a piece of code. If your eyes are trained, you'll be able to read and see what exactly the code is asking the computer. So you write that code and you press execute, and then the computer will go to the database and pull out exact details that you asked for. So that's one way of doing it, and there are multiple languages. The most commonly used in banking industry is SQL, and then there are other tools where you don't have to write the code. I think we covered that. There's like more like dashboards, screens. You don't need to learn the code, but again, you are restricted to whatever that screen will let you see or pull. Right, the
Right.
code gives you more flexibility.
No,
I'm sorry, Gupta, did I address your question?
oh, yes, absolutely, Ravinder. So thank you. So now we understand what a data analyst is, how data flows in banking sector, and what kinds of agencies or stakeholders they look at the information. So now if somebody listening, like a school going kid or a college going student or somebody who wants to make a transition to this role if they are interested into, so how can they determine if this role is right for them?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gurtej. Is this role or similar role, right? Is it right for you? I'll suggest do some research on the data concepts. If you find it even remotely interesting, I think you need to explore a little bit more. If you feel you find it interesting, the other question to think about is that do you think you're good with creating documentation, because you have to do quite a bit of that. Do you like to interact with people? You actually need to interact with a lot of cross-functional teams in this role. If the answer to these questions is yes, Gurtej, I think there's a good chance that you're going to do very good job at this role.
No, thank you very much, Arvinder. Sincerely appreciate it. And to our listeners, so we have learned so what information is. So there is a lot of information or data that flows in the backend, and how that information makes sense to somebody who is looking at from an analytical eye. So a data analyst role, it's very interesting. It's in the coming days, it's all information. Now it's a globally every information, whatever we enter, our name, social security, date of birth, everything is out there. And these organizations, companies, they use that information to target the audience. So if we say of election, if we say of a company like Walmart, Amazon, or in banking sector. So for that, I would request everybody to please explore more about this role. And if you have any questions, you can send us those questions. And Arvinder is always there. So he's somebody who we know and who is close by, whom you see on your day-to-day basis. So you can always ask questions for clarification. So with that said, I'll thank Arvinder. And Arvinder, if you have some parting thoughts with us, please share.
Absolutely, Gurtej. I think you actually nailed it down. Any questions, please feel free to send it Gurtej's way or my way. Happy to help. And thanks for having me here, Gurtej.
No, thank you very much, Arvinder, and I would thank everybody for listening. And please share the questions as well as share some thoughts. So, what kinds of topics you want to listen in future? We will be back with our weekly podcast with a professional to help you out, to educate, to engage you, and to instill some of the interest in you to explore new opportunities that are around you. So, thank you very much again. Thank you, Arvinder.